Hi everyone, and welcome to my IR seminar. So this is a non-expert's guide to debating international relations motions. It's not a replacement for your international relations courses, lectures, and seminars if you're taking them. I highly recommend against using any of this stuff in an actual course. So, first, how to prepare effectively for IR motions, because even if you are in university IR courses, but especially if you only have high school social studies, you've been taught history poorly. Then we're going to go through some international relations concepts that you can use in debate. We're not actually going to go through common mistakes and opportunities. I cut that section in the interest of time. And then we're going to go through an example of international relations and all the things that I've talked about. So, why are IR motions hard? If you talk to enough pros, you'll eventually find people who are going to complain about how difficult IR is. Every single debate motion in the world requires a certain amount of knowledge about the background and the basics of the premise of why you are debating in the first place. IR has a particular set of knowledge that most people have been taught very poorly because the way that we teach history is often woefully inadequate in terms of what debaters need to be debating these motions. So, part of the reason why it's so hard is because a large part of debating well at IR is unlearning all of the things that you've learned previously, unless you had a particularly good teacher in high school, which is entirely possible. It's the only reason I'm any good at this. So, how to prepare effectively. First thing you need to know, and the first thing that your teachers never taught you properly, is reading maps. Maps are literally everything. Geography is destiny. Everything that you ever need to know about international relations, you can learn from this. Done.
How do I know the U.S. is really...
Shush. So, there are obviously many different types of maps. This is a particularly useless one, actually. But looking at maps is the way that you are going to understand all of the context for why modern conflicts occurred, why they are still occurring, or where and when and how they are going to occur. So, look for borders, look for regions, look for things beyond just knowing the capitals of every country in the world, because that is largely, and in fact almost entirely, useless information to you. So, you are looking for the borders and boundaries of ethnic groups. You're looking for language barriers, religion barriers, trade routes and trade volume, and looking at understanding how the world actually works in a very real context. Because that's going to tell you which countries are in power, which ones are in decline, which ones are awesome. If you spend a lot of time staring at maps, you will understand international relations with no other form of schooling, at least insofar as debate happens. There are several debate rounds where my prep started with, okay, I'm going to think about the map in my head and think, okay, what are the relevant features of the map of this country? The round in question was Turkey, which is also a fantastic example that I don't have time to go through today. So, in terms of studying maps effectively, look for places of tension where things overlap with one another. So ethnic groups and language groups especially, but also where like trade happens, look for points of tension, because that's also where debates are going to be set. Understanding the effects of terrain. So here, I really wish that Douglas was here because he would have a laugh at what I'm going to talk about next, is that most of the time, terrain will create natural barriers that countries will generally have set themselves along. So that's why that first mountain, like that first terrain map that I showed is actually kind of useful. Is that understanding the importance of rivers, mountains, deserts, and what it means to form a country between those natural points will tell you a lot about stuff. Like the reason why Russia is where Russia is a series of rivers to one side, a series of mountains to their south, and then a vast empty wasteland that no one else cares about in the other direction. And that explains to you how Russia comes about and why Russia is the shape that it is. So, understanding the importance of terrain. The next one is knowing your hegemons. So this is something that requires just a little bit of background reading and a bit of understanding, but is usually pretty easy to understand if you read news articles about those regions. So generally the hegemons are the biggest countries. This isn't always the case, especially where you have islands that you've heard of for any reason other than vacationing. So Britain and Japan count for very important countries within their regional frameworks, despite the fact that they're very small, because islands have historically been very beneficial in the course of history. So, know your hegemons, look for places of tension, and understand the boundaries that are set by where people live. The next part, preparing effectively through the use of history. So the reason why I say that you've been taught history poorly is A, because you weren't taught history based on maps. You were taught history based on dates, and that's largely irrelevant. Avoid historical analogy. Avoid the temptation to use historical examples and say, well, it worked here, therefore it's going to work there. Those analogies are always fraught with an incredible amount of danger, because all it takes is somebody that knows a little bit more about the analogy and why it falls apart, or someone who can guess as to why that analogy falls apart. So, for instance, the Vietnam War is a very poor analogy for the Iraq War because the contexts are very different. The Cold War is very different than the War on Terror. If you know any of the reasons for why that's the case, you can show why the Vietnam War and Iraq wars are actually quite different, despite how often people analogize them and conflate the two. Bad analogies will hurt you in debate rounds, so avoid using them. The utility of history is understanding the context of countries. So put an emphasis when you are reading about history. I really like Wikipedia. It's fantastic because it's short and it's to the point. The emphasis should be on the reasons for why things are happening. Understanding, for instance, why the Islamic State is the way that it is much more important than understanding the dates and people who are a part of the movement. Understanding the reasons is more important than the how and the when you're looking at history. So understand why things are happening. Get behind the major movements that are going on in the world and their philosophical and political justifications. If you are going to be preparing for IR rounds, that's what's useful. Again, because debate in general is all about setting up the context, is about setting up why I care, why it's important, and how you can show that you understand what's going on. So, like I said, Wikipedia is fantastic. Long-form journalism, if it's less than 5 pages long, it's not worth your time to read, at least in terms of understanding history. You need long articles to get historical context. But also just asking questions yourself. So this is another reason why I like looking at maps. It's because you can be like, this country, what's this country's history? And you'll learn a lot of really cool and interesting things that might actually come in handy in a debate round, especially if you're asking questions about important countries. Though understanding the history of Kazakhstan is also pretty cool and pretty interesting. So don't give that a miss, because you will learn interesting and useful concepts even from studying countries that you will never have to debate about, that you can apply in terms of context. There's also lots of great podcasts that do history in funny ways or really entertaining ways, and use those. The next part of preparation is empathy. Try to understand people who are different than you. That's going to be really useful in IR rounds for a couple of reasons that I'm going to keep on getting back to. What is rational for you sitting here in Canada is not necessarily rational for someone sitting in Saudi Arabia, someone in Syria, someone in Germany, someone in the US, someone in Brazil. One of the movies that I really recommend watching for the emphatic point that it makes is Robert McNamara's Fog of War. It's probably one of the most influential movies in my style of debating. If you would like to debate like me, watch The Fog of War. It's fantastic. But there are lots of other really useful documentaries that are going to teach you lots of interesting things about other people's perspectives on the world, and those are key to winning in IR debates, is being able to get into the heads of other people and understand why they're doing what they're doing. That'll help you make them look more rational, and so you will look more rational. Any questions about general preparatory stuff? I'm sorry if you had fantastic teachers and you feel offended, but most students come out of high school with a very poor understanding of history, even if they know the dates and times of people. So look for the reasons, look for the whys, not the whens. You'll get much more out of your history lessons. Yep?
Are you going to talk about how to actually structure the preparation time, like the 15 minutes?
A little bit near the end, okay. Yeah. That was mostly homework. That's stuff that I want you to do as a regular exercise. It's really useful. It's a lot of fun, too. You'll learn a lot of cool facts that you can talk to people about. I hate assigning homework in the middle of the semester to people who aren't actually my students, but this is far more enjoyable than the homework you're getting in your classes, I can assure you. So, in terms of IR debate, what I want to go through are some basic principles and some easily accessible frameworks that you can use to better understand IR motions. Again, like I said at the beginning, these are not exhaustive. They're not particularly intellectually rigorous, and you can probably use them in your 101 classes and stuff if you have them, but I wouldn't recommend using them in higher level courses because they're pretty basic. So, the first thing is that every country in the world, no matter what you might think about it, is rationally self-interested. So this doesn't just mean military strength. There are lots of rational self-interests that extend beyond military security. There is trade and economic security and prosperity. There's also diplomatic and cultural legitimacy, as well as a whole myriad of other things that countries consider to be important and within their self-interests. And this is why it's important to empathize with them, is that if you can understand their self-interests, know what they are, but also why they have them, you're going to be able to more effectively debate from their perspective and from their self-interests when you're debating. Self-interest is also always driven by tangible, measurable factors. So one of the things that you should be looking for as a check mark in terms of your prep going into an IRR round is, do I have a solid metric for my actor's self-interests? What is my goal that my country that I'm debating about wants to achieve, and will I be able to get there? Always make sure that at the end of prep, you have at least thought of that question, even if you don't have a completely solid answer for it yet. Of course, self-interest also has to be bounded by proportionality. So the United States may have a self-interest in global security, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be putting boots on the ground in every single possible situation of people getting upset. So there is always a balance of interests. There's always going to be competing interests, and usually identifying at least two sets of competing interests is going to be of great value to you in your IR rounds. So there are valid reasons for every form of action, from complete inaction to just jumping in and getting dirty and messy. One of the things that's important, though, is to always question the underlying premises that are common in our society. For instance, there's a lot of stuff about military interventionism that I just describe here as being completely fucked. Because there is a general premise that we always have to do something, that action always has to happen. There was a big controversy recently in the House of Commons about Canadian participation in IS, and I'm not going to mention too much more about that. But think about the question that, is action always the best course of action? Or are there other things that we could do that are more limited, or is doing anything at all problematic, and should we avoid it? That is a legitimate position to hold, regardless of the general consensus of our society. Yeah?
First, no, it's not. Secondly, but a general point, I'll point out, I'm not sure Rob already mentioned this, but I just want to throw this out there. When we talk about a country's interests, those aren't necessarily just defined as in things that are good for a country, as in oil and money and shit. A country can also have ideological interests. So back in the day, the USSR might want to intervene somewhere because they actually live in communism. Or today, as Western liberal democracies, we do care if other people live in Western liberal democracies. It's sort of a good thing. And you can argue that we should intervene for those reasons. So it doesn't just have to be, you doing your best Henry Kissinger impression, going, oh, that's my perfect self-interest. You can also argue your position, we as the USA have an ideological reason for doing this. We think it's defensible for those reasons.
Yeah. So it kind of falls under a more nuanced version of diplomatic and cultural legitimacy. It's you need to actually believe in your self-interests, but they don't just have to be money and bullets and boots on the ground kind of stuff. It can be a lot more nuanced and bigger. So just as sort of an example, this house would intervene in your favorite failed state. So identifying just a couple of self-interests right off the bat, you have security, because a failed state is prone to causing terrorist outbursts, destabilizing its neighbors, armed conflict within itself and with its neighbors. There's the legitimacy question. If you are invested in a peaceful, orderly world, failed states are generally against your interests in maintaining that. There's also protection in terms of protecting the people who are actually there, not only yourself. So in terms of proportionality, the questions you should be asking: to what extent is failed state dangerous? Will our actions improve or reduce that danger? Does the existence of the failed state fundamentally endanger order? Will our intervention increase that order? Will the failed state cause a humanitarian crisis? Will it become greater through intervening? I like how close FS is to other acronyms we could be talking about. And of course, the likelihood of success of any operation that you want to undertake. So, the next part, rationality. All countries are run by rational people. There are no crazy people running governments at any point in the world right now. However, I'll get into that later, actually. Differences, however, exist in what we consider to be rational. They can be motivated by factors outside of democratic goodwill and everybody being happy. Greed is perfectly rational. Domination is perfectly rational. And in more instances than not, religious edict is also a rational set of goals that you can pursue, regardless of how irrational you think it is. They think it is. And so you should be debating within that context. Treat other actors with the respect that they deserve as rational people. So, this comes back to another one of my favorite concepts in IR that I would like to illustrate some of these concepts through. Mutually assured destruction is a pretty stupid ideology if you actually get down to it, for a simple reason. Two rational actors can misunderstand each other's rational decisions and the outcomes of those misunderstandings. So, what you see in 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis is two perfectly rational people that nearly destroyed the world because they were working on different forms of rationality and didn't try to understand each other until the very last moment. And that's why crisis was averted. So, consider always that the rationality that you are proposing in your rounds is limited by your ability to empathize and understand the rationality of the other people that you are doing actions in the international stage against. So use that as well to clarify the metrics of your rationality. Given that people easily misunderstand each other's rational frameworks, if you are in a debate round, make sure that you are explaining your rational frameworks. Explain your reasoning to me so that the same reasons why MAD doesn't work also don't lead to you losing the round. That's something that's important to keep in mind.
And just to emphasize something here with rationality and distinction people often miss, is that when you're talking about what's in your rational interest, you're talking about what's in the rational interest of the politicians and decision makers running the state. So when we say what's in China's interest, we're not saying what's in the interest of China, like this grand spiritual collective interests of the Chinese people. We're talking about the interests of the Chinese Communist Party officials that run the country, which explains why it may be rational for Russia to dick around in the Ukraine, because it's rational for Vladimir Putin to run Crimea, not necessarily the country as a whole.
This is why I'm glad Douglas was here. So, the next part. Again, coming back to this idea of things that you should be doing in prep. Geography is destiny. Everything comes down to geography and demography, but that's also tied, yada, yada, yada. That's a distinction you don't really need to make. So, there are several levels of interaction in terms of how geography is going to determine a country's interactions with the world. The first one is direct. You're looking at border friction and border synergy. You're looking at regional differences. So, cultural, economic, and military hegemons, pariahs, client states, a bunch of other stuff I'm going to get into and define a little bit later, as well as international. So what is your legitimacy on the world stage is an actual legitimate concern for people to have. That is a self-interest that they can possess. There's also the difference between great powers politicking and little powers politicking. And I can't get into the full breadth of that. That's entire courses of length. But those are questions to be thinking about. Is my actor a big country? Are they a big mover and shaker? Or is the actor that I have to defend someone who is trying to defend their own self-interests in a world where everybody else can bully them and push them around? And ask those kinds of questions. So, getting into hegemons. Hegemons in sphere politics is still a thing, regardless of how much we would love to believe that the world is a nice, orderly place where everyone gets along. Everything is still based around centers of power. So, hegemony. What does that actually mean? It means that there are countries in the world that are norm-setting and they are the dominant arbitrators. They don't always act through direct application of force, but always have the power of implied force to create their control over other countries. And not every country that is within a hegemon's immediate area is directly aligned with them. But the hegemons are sort of the axis of power within that region, and so everyone is either aligned to or resisting against that hegemon within a region. So in terms of the history of how that worked, you had old historical hegemonies that kind of collapse after World War II, being replaced with two hegemons, the USSR and the United States. The USSR collapses, the US becomes the global hegemon for about 15 years, and now we've devolved into a system much more determined by regional hegemons. Short list being the United States, European Union, mostly Germany and France, Russia, China, and India, Japan kind of, sort of, not really. And Africa is still sort of a toss-up, but Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa are usually the important Knowing the countries that are important is kind of easy if you look at the news. The countries that are always in the news are the ones that are most important. Oh, I forgot about Iran and Turkey and Egypt. Those ones are important. So smaller countries exist within the spheres of their hegemons. Not all hegemonic relationships are like nasty Bismarckian realpolitik kind of nastiness. The character of the hegemon will greatly influence the relationships that they have with their client states. So a client state of the United States, like Canada, has a very different relationship to their hegemon than Iraq does to Iran or Ukraine has to Russia. And so it's important to consider not only are you a hegemon or are you a client state, but what is your relationships? These are, again, homework kind of stuff, but also something that you can usually tell from maps. This is one of my favorite slides. Hegel's End to History and You. So, the first thing about international relations that is a common mistake that I want to caution against as well is don't name drop philosophies and theoricians and yada yada yada. Explain to us what they talked about and why it matters. So, Hegel's End to History is useful in a debate context because what Hegel proposes in a very dumbed down way that you should never write on a philosophy paper is that you have two opposing forces. One is fighting for the status quo as it exists. One is fighting for a new status quo that they would like to create. What is going to come out of that conflict is something new. So when you are prepping for a debate case, especially about IR motions, it's very useful to identify what is the status quo that my actor is currently existing in? What is the status quo that this resolution would like to try and create? And then what is going to be my stance as a result of that? How am I going to create a synthesis between those two opposing views? Because you don't necessarily have to take the camp of one or the other. You can actually say, these are the problems, these are the forces, this is our solution, this is how we think that the resolution of this conflict is going to go, and that's what we would like to support. And the opposition can then take a different route. That's totally legitimate in debate and is very useful. So clearly identify those whenever you can and use them to your advantage because they're a great framework that you can use to understand debate rounds and present your arguments within them. So, this is kind of a way to put all of that together and hopefully be able to make sure that you're asking leading questions. First, who are the actors? This is the most important part, and this is why it's also important to study maps. Is because in a roundabout Turkey, obviously one of the important actors is going to be Turkey. But if you look at a map, you'll notice that Turkey is a bridge between Europe and Asia. In a very real sense, in the sense that it's a spit of land across two big bodies of water that separate two continents. Like, metaphorically it's a bridge, but also quite physically it's a bridge. And this is why geography matters. Huh? Yes. Yeah, well, technically there's a very small amount of water in between them, and that's actually even more significant. So, they obviously have relations with Europe. That's going to be one of your big actors. They are a key mediator in the Middle East, one of your key actors. They separate Russia from everybody else through the Mediterranean, so Russia is going to matter. And so immediately from just looking at a map or remembering a map, you can identify that there are going to be 4 primary actors you should probably address at some point in this debate round. Then you can start asking yourself everything and anything that you know about those actors and how they relate to this conflict. Next, once you've identified who the actors are, identify their self-interests. What does Turkey care about? What does the Middle East, hard as that is to define, care about? What does the European Union care about? What does Russia care about? How do those interact? You're not necessarily going to use everything, but I really recommend brainstorming in IR rounds because you never know what nugget of information you're going to be able to pull up that actually comes in handy in a debate round. So try and go through and figure out what their interests are so that you can sort of predict where the big clashes in the round are going to be. What is their rational framework? What kind of country do they exist as? So like, are they a free and liberal democracy? Are they a less free and less liberal democracy? Are they an oligopoly? Are they a dictatorship? These kinds of things to start to identify what are the kind of things I need to be thinking about? What is the mindset that I need to put myself into when I'm thinking about their rational decisions? And then where are they in the world? Are we talking about major power brokers? Are we talking about little countries? Are we talking about big conglomerates of nations or really tiny ethnic groups within a nation? All of these things are things that are useful to ask. So, as an example I would like to walk you through a country that is perfectly rational, perfectly self-interested, determined by geography, and is basically everything that I've talked about in terms of how states interact defined. It is my favorite hyper-rational state. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. What? So, with very basic knowledge of North Korea, you can very easily dismantle the idea that North Korea is crazy and give you a whole bunch of really interesting metrics to use when you're talking about North Korea and how to approach around so that when you're like, wait a second, I have to defend North Korea? How on earth do I do that? They're crazy. You can be like, wait a second, they're not actually that crazy. So, that's their historical context, their geography, and their power in politics, not necessarily in that order. So, first thing that you recognize when you look at a map and you see North Korea is that it's right beside China. So China's going to matter a whole lot in terms of North Korea's decision-making, whether it wants to or not, because China's really big. And if you know anything about China, you also know that it's really, really, really important. So, why is Korea divided? It used to be a country, it's not anymore. That was the Korean War, and the outcomes of that, just like many wars that have been fought, determine the course of history almost ever after, basically until another one is fought. So, America wins against North Korea, pushes them all the way up to the Chinese border. The Chinese can't tolerate that, because this is at the height of the Cold War. The last thing that you want is an ideologically opposed power right on your border. Simple kind of stuff to understand. We don't like enemies being on our borders. That's called border friction. So, China pushes back. America can't lose all of Korea to the Chinese for the same reasons. They are ideologically supporting their allies. They can't lose. China also can't lose. So they come to a pretty awful compromise, which is to divide the country in half and create a buffer state between China and the United States. What this means is that under no circumstances can North Korea fall apart. North Korea cannot fail. However, it also can't particularly succeed. Yay! And so all sorts of weird stuff starts happening. Because as any communist experiment will tell you, or dictatorship experiment in general will tell you, as soon as people start, having freedom and having free markets and making money, their societies tend to do weird things. They modernize. They become influenced by other powers. They slowly stop being quite as willing to take whatever their hegemons throw at them, and tend to develop their own policies. But furthermore, North Korea exists as the last bastion of communism, basically. There is a lot of face that matters in terms of not letting it fall apart. But also that whenever North Korea has tried to modernize and tried to introduce some free market reforms, and it has several times, every time what it leads to is an erosion of the power of the ruling elite. And they don't like that. Because like any dictatorship, it is fundamentally reactionary. You always have to consider what are the interests of the ruling elite, even if there are millions of peasants who are starving and dying. They don't exist within a democratic society where their will means anything. If you're looking just at the ruling elite, they know that China won't let them fail because China won't let that buffer state disappear. And they don't want to let it fail because they get lots of awesome privileges from running a country as their own personal fiefdom. So they will do whatever they can to hold on to power. Unfortunately, what they can actually do is pretty limited, and this leads to a lot of the brinkmanship and oppression that you see coming out of North Korea. So, even more crazy, aggressive stuff. Yeah, why are you so crazy to everybody else? It's because they're rationally interested in their own survival. So they will do literally anything to assure that their state remains strong and remains legitimate. Unfortunately, as anyone who has studied history will know, dynasties get weaker over time. And if you look at North Korea in particular, if you've ever read the Wikipedia page for Kim Jong-un, you would know that he is the third son, which isn't usually how hereditary monarchies function. That's because the first son defected, and the second son was caught sneaking into Disneyland in Japan. And so was a completely illegitimate ruler for their country that is based around the strength of the regime and the strength of the ruling family at enforcing the cultural tenets of the Korean doctrine. So, you have an illegitimate heir ruling a country He was never supposed to rule. You have no means of democratic legitimacy. You have no means of international legitimacy because you're a horrible pariah state. What do you do? The only option that you have available to you is strength. North Korea can't get any stronger through its conventional military. It's pretty much the limits of how many people it can conscript and how many tanks it can point its soul. So, what are your options? Welcome to why North Korea is exploring nuclear weapons. It's not to threaten the United States necessarily, or even Japan. It's to demonstrate that the regime is still strong enough and is still dangerous enough that you cannot allow it to collapse. If North Korea has nuclear weapons, it can use them as a tool in terms of brinkmanship, to say, pay attention to us, help us, or else we will have nukes, and look at how crazy we are with everything else. But it also means that if the regime starts to falter, they go to China and say, if we fall apart, you have nuclear weapons on your border, and you have no idea where they're going. And that's the kind of brinkmanship that leads to the cynical compromise of North Korea in all of its wackiness. Everyone knows that the game is rigged, but no one can call the bluff. They are in a pretty invulnerable situation for doing that, but it's always something on the table, and that's why we go through these cycles of North Korea being like, hey guys, we're getting nukes. Everybody freaking out, having talks. North Korea gets a huge aid package, and releasing of some sanctions that it doesn't really like in favor for ones it doesn't particularly care about, and things trundle along. The risk is too high for us to intervene, A, because it's right next to China. We tried this once before. But B, any country that cares enough about its citizens or people in general not to want to have them submitted to a terrible regime also doesn't want to send them into the mountains to be killed, given that North Korea is an incredibly dangerous place to launch a war against. So we don't really have the option of intervention. There are lots of structural reasons why North Korea isn't simply going to liberalize and become okay. And that's how you approach North Korea from a rational standpoint. You identify, how are we going to deal with a country that we know we can't intimidate, but that fundamentally relies on us for its legitimacy? How do we prop up a facade, and how do we prevent it from doing all sorts of nasty things without it imploding? And that's the question that you're asking in North Korea. Entirely rational, self-interested country. It's just that all of its rational self-interests lead it to do things that you think are crazy. That's why I love North Korea.
Weird. Just two quick things, and then you can all debate. First of all, just to point something out here, whenever you're looking at countries, be careful to not slip into just using standard Western standards to evaluate them, like Robbie just did, because in Confucian cultures, there is actually no precedence given to the firstborn son. If you look at the way that dynasties inherit, they're perfectly willing to go to any of the children. And I don't making fun of Robbie, but just a general thing, make sure that you're not just carrying over the biases from what you know into a situation where it might not apply at all. Second thing though, just quickly, in a broader sense, keep in mind that when we have client states like this, and this is a lot of IR, they also have their own interests. So if you look at a lot of things that North Korea does, yes, China wants to prop them up, but it isn't Beijing can phone them up and they'll do anything. In fact, most of North Korean history is them trying to get closer to Russia because they don't want to be dominated by China. And you see that also with a lot of other countries in the region, for example, where they're not trying to either get closer to the US or closer to Russia because they don't want to be solely reliant on one source. They don't want to be dominated. So always keep in mind that even when you're talking about these smaller states that are clients that are in this sphere, they also have their own interests and they may not always act in line with the hegemon because that might not be good for them.
Yes. Cool. So that's the end of the seminar. Hope you don't feel too sad. IR can be kind of depressing. So yeah, we are going to start getting debating. One of the things that I really recommend about IR is don't feel intimidated. IR does require a little bit of learning, but you can do it. I believe in you.
Thanks, Ryan. Hey, I'm on camera now. This is fun.